Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today is like many other weeks, as I've wanted to work on another environment and image this week, so it's another Speedpaint here. This week is a scene sort of thing where I had been trying to convey possible hints towards a story, just without making anything too obvious. So, with very little delay, let's just get straight into this. And as usual, I will sort of be walking through the creative process as we go here, which means starting off with the roots of the ideas. Now, as of late, I have been making quite a lot of references to another project that's in the works, and other things at the side that I'm working on. The video from last week tied into it, and there have been plenty of chances where it has come up as of late. And as much as I wish I could say otherwise, this one also has partial roots in it too. I know, a lot of my discussions lately have started here, and there really isn't too much I can really say about it without giving away chunks of that project, and sort of spoiling what I'm looking to do with it at the moment. However, this one is partially tied into it, and by the time I'd finished the sketch, had become its own thing. So this time at least, I really only need to touch on it a little bit here before moving on to how it became its own. After all, part of the world stuff meant that one night I was just sort of sketching a range of possible locations of interest for a range of things and stories. These ranged from fields, mountains, villages and buildings, towns and interiors. All sorts of anything really. It's more the stage of throwing things out there to build a reference of various spaces that I can then reference or draw off later where I need to, or where I want to. This, as implied, began as one of those where I had been sketching off ideas surrounding things lost in the forest, and sort of building up different atmospheres and feelings for a range of them within the world. There had been a set of them to a degree. One had been a camp someone set up, another a cottage. There were some with animals and plants, and really anything that I felt could fit into these spaces, like rivers and ponds as well. Some of them were normal, others were more magic. This one had been looking at ruins forgotten in the forest, and some sort of statue or idol there, without a specific story yet tying into it. I mean, I thought they could tie into the religious aspect for a while of the world, yet that route did change, and now the story is something yet again unknown and unrelated to the other project, which again is why it became its own thing. I liked the idea and decided that I would develop it on its own, rather than strictly tying it into the world by force as well. And doing this, the idea changed a couple dozen more times, just before I settled on a sketch and settled on a new approach that I would take, as it did settle for a while before I finished it. I mean, I will touch on it as I go here, but there were considerations almost constantly of other routes I could take the image in, and different ideas that were possible. So it had been rather fun to work out and work with, even at the starting point. I mean, during the sketching phase, I got to question how hidden this is. I mean, if it was completely overrun and overgrown, it would be clear no one has come to it for a while. Yet I could take a route where it was clean to a degree, as if someone has kept it for a while, or maybe imply a degree of magic to the piece. My other option was to include signs of ruins and the crumbling walls, yet add offerings at the base of the figure. Things like candles or fruit and flowers, as if it is still frequented by someone or a small group, despite the state of the building that once surrounded it. Each is similar, yet the implied story is slightly different in each, and it sort of creates different impressions from it. In the end, I chose the middle, as it tied into the later debate I will get into with the colour palette. For now, I had the sketch and a sort of idea set out, and it meant that I could begin working on it and taking it a bit further. Which, actually, rather suitably, ties us into the colour palette here. See, before I even began this stage, I had the debates over what I would do for it. At one point, I had considered making this image my practice for gradient maps, as opposed to last week's sketch. So, in that vein, I had thought, after that, to maybe repeat it, and to see how it may differ for something more complicated like this, where there is more sections going on, and more details to be considered, and that would be covered by the gradient. But that approach would have meant starting in grayscale and considering the colours and colour palette later, just like last week's did. However, I also wanted to have more fun with this and explore potentially including the gradient maps later down the line with a colour image. So it sort of meant that I did my usual of letting it sit for a bit whilst I decide, and to be honest, even then I wasn't sure until later in the process. You'll notice it too with a bit of back and forth. I do go back and forth with this particular element quite a bit, and it is again only later that I settle on anything for the process. I mean, I start in colour and partway through I did a correction layer to take away the saturation. This choice potentially letting me decide to work in value instead, but it was also then something reversible in case I changed my mind or decided instead that I would rather keep the colour. And it was a layer that I could still keep if I decided I wanted it in monochrome. In this stage too, I messed with potentially including some gradient maps as a colour, as a tie into last week as well. Yet, again, it was a choice I moved away from and instead began to look at colour palettes and themes that I could potentially tie into everything. And I did consider quite a few. There was a lot of back and forth, again, on different shades of green and messing with different options of the palette until deciding to work with one and see how it went. I only really decided on a palette in this one just by deciding that I needed something to stick with. And if I liked it less down the line, I would just make it work, or I could change it then. But I just needed to get started with something and see how it went. And this deciding phase was quite a while too, mainly during the flats. And it didn't really end until I'd finished the piece and finished the flat stage entirely of the image either. See, I wanted the forest and the leaves, yet then wasn't sure on the value of each and how much they should overlap. So I instead looked at other options. I mainly did this for a short while setting up circles of colour at the side, and then altering the image's hue as a way of experimenting with how it would look, or to see if this method and using the hue gave me a palette idea that I liked a lot more, or decided I would go with a more normal and natural theme to it. And in the end, I did stick with the first options I considered. It worked the best in this case, and it was something I felt would be a better outcome, rather than needing to divert the colour too much. There is always the chance for something similar at a later date where I do mess with the colours a bit more anyway, so there wasn't really much lost in this sense, and it did let me focus on enjoying this drawing particularly. Though before moving on, there had been a single lingering question around the colour, and it's one that I never really settled. Even at this moment, I haven't settled it. See, this drawing and video has technically got two outcomes from this image, as ultimately I couldn't settle this debate as I got further with it all either. It's also a nice way to transition into discussing the details in this piece, as it is part of the main drawing. Now, the figure. They are, by no debate, the central focus point. They're the part that people are meant to notice first, and it's the part that I put the focus on. Normally, this means it's the part I am the most certain of, or the detail I knew first and formed the image around. However, with this one, I have never quite settled on the figure's colour, though it becomes less obvious later in the video. As I have mentioned, I looked at the figure and the idea that this is a forgotten or decaying monument to something equally as forgotten. Maybe a divine being, maybe a hero or historical figure whose story has faded as time progresses. It was never really settled with myself who they are either. Yet, the thing that I mainly struggled with was the choice to include them in colour, or to make them monochrome as if they're more like a stone monument and statue. In the first line of reasoning, it sort of adds a sense of life to them, and it implies an idea of magic to the scene in a way. I mean, they can be a real person posing in an old space, or a statue untouched by time. They may be alive, they may not be. It's the route I let myself take, as it had proven the most fun for it, and the story was still there, but something less obvious. More stories lingered in the details, and there wasn't always a guaranteed answer when questioning if they're alive, or a statue, or something else in this space. It left more room for the viewer to fill in those gaps, which I did enjoy with it. Though I do still try to make it a little less alive in most senses. It's why I went with the muted purple as their skin tone and shaded it as such. However, in the second line of reasoning, it better reflects the idea of it being a statue specifically, or a monument. It's less lively and, in a sense, lifeless, other than the hints of magic echoing through via the headpiece and the glowing elements in the piece. At the end of it, this version better sells the idea that it's been left and abandoned or forgotten over time, as the figure is more of a statue as opposed to anything else. Also, I like this outcome for it, yet I wasn't sure which one of the two worked best for this detail. So in the end, I finished it in colour as I could play and mess with it more than my other option, yet I also knew I could change it better at the last moment if it was in colour, as opposed to going the other way. I mean, it's easier to take colour away than add it over top of shading as this approach. And this approach also lets it sit better within the environment and the piece as a whole, rather than the grey option. Though I suppose the choice of which is best is up to everyone at this point. Most people I've asked, mainly family at this point and the time of writing this, prefer the colour version at a glance. Yet it could very easily be that it's because it's brighter and it draws more attention more than the grey one does. One of them giving me that as the only reason for it. Yet, in a way, both have their perks and they both have their strong points. The grey variant has a more obvious story to it as its strongest point, and yet the coloured variant has a bit more of a focal point to it and it hints more to a tale rather than telling it. Though, away from that, the figure as a focal point had been quite fun to look at, and it went through a range of other ideas beyond this one. So, looking at the rest of the figure, and not just the colour, the ideas for them began with ties to the world. This isn't a sketch I had for the Divine Branches, yet the figures themselves had begun as a draft for a person of a myth or a story relating to the other project. They tied into it, in other words, but weren't themselves any sort of worshipped figure. The story idea I had been working off then tied into the sun. Who they were particularly or what they did was up for debate. It was something I won't go into much detail here with, yet also something I'd actively been working out as I went with everything alongside it. Though the early tie did manage to influence how I approached this idea. See, it meant in the early phases I had the sun connections when I took the idea as a standalone thing. I mean, one version saw them with the first concept for a sun-related divine figure, and another was the divine on their own, in this same environment. So really, I knew I wanted the ties to remain. It then sort of let me consider how they'd be tied into it all before actually looking at finalising anything. This is then where the headpiece came in. It was a sort of holdover from the divine sketches where this image of a circle was a nod towards the sun and mirrored a halo sort of impression. I will admit that it's a sort of trial run for this version where I was working out the details of the halo for the other character, so you may end up seeing something similar again at a later date. But it was also just worked out in this context to add towards the story and wonder. It isn't explained, which I like, and again mirrors something of the sun. The diamond details in it are meant to be a nod towards the rays, something sharper. The circles and such are then a kind of gesture to the sun, as stated, alongside the glow that it has. And the design did work out well. I like it a lot. I will most likely use it in a character later, as I plan to, and I suppose in that way this drawing is still tied into the upcoming project very slightly. It's a subtle and small nod in that sense, and a rough draft disguised as a full drawing. It adds to the story of the piece slightly. It adds a few questions and a bit more of wonder to it, which I didn't feel like I needed to answer at this time. And at the end of the day, that is why I decided to include it and keep it. Even when I'd gone down the stone and statue route and considered if it would even fit with that theme, I still kept it because it was part of the character and part of the piece. And ultimately I decided that it would fit even if I went down that route. I mean, the only thing that I had delaying me about that was how would stone glow? My answer, if I'd gone down that route, that I can tell you was simple. Magic. Leave it at that and move on. Work it out later if I want to, but the answer will still lie within a sort of magic system somehow. Whether it ties it more into the other project or not is then something to be seen if I decide to give a strict answer for it. Though keeping the halo and this thin connection did convince me to continue subtle nods to things throughout the figure. And I will admit, there's only one or two more things that I can talk about with her before we move on. Yet I did enjoy thinking about it all and then seeing how it came together. The second detail to mention though is the dress, as it sort of ties into the debate I've been discussing here. See, the dress itself had a few iterations and sketches which varied on options. And it also varied on the intended colour palette that I'd been considering during the sketching phases. When the figure is meant to be more of a statue, I had the dress be something simpler and less intricate. I know sculptors can do some remarkable things with a stone, yet I felt that it was better fitting to be simple, as it was still meant to be entirely intact and something with less details, so to speak. Detail sections on a stone statue like this may have chipped or grown weak over time depending on the elements it's been left to. This meant that if I wanted to draw it as stone with an intricate dress, there would have to be blemishes or parts missing that I didn't really want to go into. But it does mean that for the details in those sorts of dresses meant that they were quite different. Mainly as I had to remove things like sheer elements and considered removing the halo for a bit. But in the end I didn't do either of these. For starters, one iteration saw the skirt as a single piece, and another it had a split in it at the side. I really wasn't sure what to do with it until I settled on this sort of wrapped appearance and just went with what is seen. The details came as I considered the first path of having the colour included in the figure. It made sense as well, since I did want the figure to have a degree of detail and interest to sort of match the environment around them. The first of these had been the sheer detail on the shoulders to sort of cover that section. And I know sculptors can make things appear transparent or something with the right techniques, but in this piece it really worked best when I had the appearance of colour on it to make it clear that it had something below, which in the colour version could be seen. Plus it made it interesting to add and include it. This then led to some lace details on one part of the skirt and then further accents on the belt to add interest to that as well. Which this does lead us into the second detail I want to touch on before we move on here. See, the belt on the piece had begun as a sort of placeholder. I knew I would want something wider and more noticeable as I went with that sort of style that I had planned so far. Besides, I knew I wanted it to mirror the end of the sleeves somehow and sort of tie it all together in that way. So I sketched out the space that it would occupy and planned to go back and add to it at the end of the sketching phase. Yet, instead from there, it sort of just worked as a simpler belt that, again, looked as if it had been wrapped around the person and sort of tied in the back. I didn't want to do a corset detailing or anything like that I typically gravitate towards, so I let myself leave it as this and lent into it. I later added a pendant to it, and then sort of another layer as well, something like a ribbon across the middle of the belt that, again, I imagined would tie in the back. All of this then came together to be detailed, yet still simple enough in both ways that it fit into the environment but also didn't take away too much attention from it and stand out too much. It wouldn't look odd or out of place if I changed my mind as well and converted it into monochrome, and it also looked great in colour as well. So it sort of meant that I kept it and moved on. The idea behind the pendant was also simple enough. Originally it was meant to be a sun or something, yet it blended too much in with the yellow belt when I did that. This meant I came to change it and tied it into the purple present in the figure, while still keeping the round shape that I echoed on some belt detailings as well, just to sort of keep it present in multiple places of the person. Besides, I used the shape as a nod towards the sun rather than the colour, and, from afar, it stands out just enough whilst also adding just enough to that area that it doesn't look empty compared to anything else or plain. Now, finally for the person, I do want to touch on part of the process. See, I did kind of cheat to a degree, as I knew the person would be very symmetrical compared to what I normally do. I wanted them to be almost as if someone had made them on purpose this way. They're also facing straight onto the camera as well, so I knew I could afford a bit of simplicity in the flats and the early stages. This is mainly why I copy half of the sections and flip them more often than I usually would. Normally, I would continue to draw both halves, so that they're slightly different from each other, and that they have the subtle differences and imperfections that are normally present in everyday life. I mean, fabric won't fold and fall identically on either side of a person without a bit of help or positioning, and there are a lot of subtle differences so that nothing is perfectly symmetrical. In this piece, I let myself lean into the symmetry of things, and I copy either side of things so that the fabric falls the same. And such as, it's been made or designed intentionally to fall in an identical way. Just something to kind of add subtlety to things that I can't say much about as it is a tiny part of everything around it, and most of the time it wouldn't really be noticed. But with the time left, let's move on to talk about the environment here. I've covered everything I possibly can with the figure, and their environment is arguably most of the image as well in this case. It's also a space I had a fair bit of disagreements with before settling on how it is seen. See, before this sort of alcove image with the crumbling wall behind, I had first imagined them to be in a sort of building more put together. The image would feature pillars and walls, fallen banners, and moss or plants claiming inside of a space before anything else. The figure would be at the end of this, on the same idea of a pedestal around it. I had considered it to be less in ruins, I suppose. Yet the natural element took over, and it was something I preferred as context to this. I still kept the back wall and the structure around her, chipping away parts of its ceiling while she was untouched. Yet that was it from that point. I took out any stone floors and the extra pillars. I instead favoured trees and the more natural elements that I will touch on later. However, it also worked better for the story I wanted to imply. See, having it inside would imply it's not as old. It could mean it's in the early processes of decay, from being forgotten, but it could also be something found and returned to in that stage. The building could be salvaged, and everything continuing when people return. However, with this one, it's clearer that if people want to restore it to what it was, there would be more work. It's been left or forgotten for longer, and it adds a hint of doubt as to if people would even know what they're looking at if they found it. I mean, there purposefully isn't text to explain it. It's just the figure untouched and alive, so if people stumble here, there isn't a building to give context to it, or texts to explain that they could read. It's just this random monument in a forest with a purpose and intent forgotten. This is really why I lent into the next few details as I added them around. See, the bushes and such work well as a background as well. It set the tone and it didn't draw the eye away from the figure and the ruins too much. So it also sort of expanded then to everything else around it. I added plants and such to the ruins and walls and the figure's podium. I added winding vines around them as well, and built on the idea that this space is slowly being claimed as well. It's a slower process, something taking a lot more time than everything else around it. The reason, again, is part of the story and the questions to be asked about it. Yet it is still being touched and gradually taken over. Only the figure at this point remains completely untouched. And that, again, was intentional. It raises the idea as to if they will be covered and consumed as well with time, or if they will remain a single figure in the middle of a forest, somehow remaining untouched by plants. Yet the detail had been fun to include and fairly simple. The vines are far back, so I didn't need to overly detail them or shade the leaves and such. I could do wider, sweeping movements to detail them and shade them, and to also tie them into the bushes I'd already planned out. Yet by adding these thinner plants, it added a bit more movement and detail to everything and a sense of connection between it all. Yes, only a few of them will hang between plants or would hang between parts of the same. Yet the ones flowing and falling still reach out towards other sections and items around the piece that imply a point where they could connect, and a point where they could form a sort of web with each other. It's kind of like those above. It's the sort of implication that those will eventually fall into a sort of curtain to cover the figure. Either that or they'd collapse with the structure should it ever happen, and part of it is already breaking. Yet it's something that hasn't happened yet. It's the early stage and what happens next is yet to be seen. A frozen moment of time, almost, with the next one unknown. And honestly, for a while, I did consider leaning further into it. I considered making it worse and adding more overgrowth to the area. Maybe making the grass longer, the flowers wilder with more thorns and roots reaching across the ground. I almost added a tree growing through the brick wall, pushing it out the way with the trunk and the roots as it claimed the space. For a while, her alcove was more plant than stone even. It ties into the considerations of the figure. If she was a statue, in these, they would be worn and older. There may be some faults to them of sections that have chipped or eroded. Yet I decided to keep them untouched and went with the avenue that had more questions whilst working on it. So I did draw back on the plants for this one. It was a healthy middle that I found, and who knows, I can always add an instalment to it another time if I wish to pick up a sketch where the plants have had more sway and more control. I may reuse the idea elsewhere or take the chance another time to draw a forest claiming some ruins or an abandoned space. I'm sure I have plenty of stories that could work with that. I could also go back to an earlier iteration where stone laid in the dirt too, before it was overtaken and forgotten. The possibilities were almost endless with this one. And, if I decide to, I could look at one with the trees that I did. I had added more into it in an earlier version, both in the foreground and background, you see. Behind the alcove thing would have been a great and giant tree, something old to almost indicate how time has passed and how much it has taken for these present changes to occur. After all, for a building to have once surrounded this figure, it would mean that the tree came after the walls had fallen. So for that very tree to then grow so large, it could take many, many years. For those, I had been working off the idea of an oak tree as well, something known for their size and how much they can grow over time. I had looked at others as well, maybe looked at adding an implication of magic through this element too. I mean, in an early draft, the tree was taller than any other in the forest. It was something that would imply it almost as a forest heart, or something to signify that the entire forest may be a newer development, and something that only occurred since the building was left and decayed. I only came to remove it as it grew confusing and conflicting almost. It took attention away from the main focus, and for the scale that I wanted to show, it would mean kind of zooming out on the entire image, which then left the figure unclear and second to the tree or entirely unseen. It basically would have made it an entirely different drawing, to be fair. So I did toy around with some other ideas and sketches as well. One's up closer with the tree as a shadow, yet it simply didn't come together as I'd hoped or intended, which meant I came to look at other routes as mentioned. Keeping it also would have meant removing the structure around her, which doing that would make it a further point of decay than I initially wanted. So with this one, I just kind of kept going with another variation of it. The other tree placements were also equally as distracting. It covered too much and made them more of a spotlight than the figure was, which, as I've said enough by now, wasn't what I'd been aiming for in any sense. I mean, some of them were cool. Adding one or two to the midground or a few more in the background did help sell more of the environment. Yet, it also had a drawback. Whatever I did with it obscured everything a bit too much. If it had only obscured things to a small degree, I would have been fine with it and continued as normal, maybe even keeping them. Yet it obscured them to a degree that raised more questions to the story and what was going on than I wanted. Normally this is also something I wouldn't mind. I have put in quite a few questions already for this piece. Yet the questions I've placed in the drawing at this point are some that you can draw a conclusion around, or come up with your own solution to. The ones created by the trees obscuring other things simply had no answer anywhere, which meant they had to go. By that, I mean there are questions and considerations present in the piece. Yet, there are some sections you can fill with your own ideas, such as the halo. If you want to, you can view it as a sign of divinity, or it could be a sign of a favoured or a saint-like figure, a hero even. There is more than one answer. For the colour, a painted statue or a living figure. There are things that you can fill in the gaps with to create the story behind it, which, Okay, it may be different to the one I'm working with, but it's a story all the same, and that is part of the fun to this. It's much harder to do that in any meaningful way when half of the image is obscured and it's hard to even see what is behind the trees in the forest. It's the same logic I use with the vines and plants. They can hang and fall all they like, move as they want, yet none really obscure the person present. I am moving into the last detail here before we run out of time, yet this detail has been small and subtle throughout most versions of this piece. The flowers were mainly done to tie in the yellow and began as part of some moss. They stem from the drawings with hints of stone to them and the versions where walls still tied into the piece, and try to contain it. They had been a representation of the start, of the beginning of the decay where the forest began its claim, and started to kind of invite itself inside through the cracks in the forgotten walls before they began to break them. Yet they also doubled as a nod to the figure in a range of developments. The yellow ties into them and adds a bit of brightness to the outcome as it brings the figure more into the environment in a way with the overlap of the colours. It's why they came to stay and remained until the end despite their purpose changing to be more of a supporting element. Yes, as I touched on, they lost thorns and vines, decreased in numbers and shifted quite a bit. Yet it was part of the forest before anything else. It's also why I came to include the water to the side of the scene in a strange way. Originally that would be stone and hold a pattern. It would be a sort of tile and a remnant of the unnatural. Something done so that it would be explicitly clear that it isn't a normal rock formation or just a simple exposed stone. It would be clear that this is something placed a long time ago by people in the space. I kept it like that for a while, through many experiments and developments, yet the flowers sort of encouraged me to look at a more natural thing, and shift decay further along in the piece. And my logic for this next bit may be a bit off, but something around the area is decaying, that being the building. The forest is aiding it, and it's becoming more natural as the structure once here no longer stands, and it leaves behind only implications of bricks, walls, and the figure. There are changes occurring in this space slowly and subtly, yet each one is shifting ever so slightly. What I am trying to say here is that the grounds are changing and it isn't confined to what it was when the building stood. So I felt that a stream passing through here could occur with the changes, and would only serve to aid in the crumbling of the structure over time as it would help the forest. But either way, it made a nice addition to that corner. If not a stream making a new path, perhaps a water feature remaining from the previous building that now is able to flow free and continue to grow. I suppose I didn't really know the source of it, yet it still fitted into the environment and it ended as another section to draw conclusions on. I mean, during one point with it, I thought it would most likely be a stream finding a new path. Perhaps when people remained, they had diverted it or built a dam somewhere further up to protect this building or use it elsewhere. If this has decayed, the building mind you, then maybe other structures in the area have as well. Though in saying all of this, it really did come together in the end, as I'd hoped. I had a challenge to shade the water section as it was such a small area of water, and most of it had been covered by the foreground details. Yet in the end it did pay off, and I didn't really consider too seriously to remove it once I decided to add it, and at no point did I really think about going back to the stone. It gave detail to that corner, and it didn't make it look empty like it otherwise had been at this point of decay, and it also helped kind of sell the point that it is further along in this point of decay, without really having much of the building remaining like I otherwise would have. And like the foreground leaves and vines and branches, it helped add that little bit of detail to the final piece and bring it all together. Now with all of that said, that is all I have to say for today. Thank you so much for watching this far, and I certainly hope you have enjoyed it as well. I will see you next time, but for now, have a wonderful day, and goodbye.